Hi, I'm Suze Shaner with Sage Leadership Strategies, and I'm your host today of Community Forum. And I have the great pleasure to have with me Nina Buxenbaum, who is a professor at York College, one of the CUNY schools. Welcome, Nina.
Hi, Suze.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having
So,
me.
um, so you, I'm going to describe you as a biracial woman who addresses themes of race and identity in her work, particularly topsy-turvy doll paintings. We could see some of those in the background.
Mhm.
So I want to get underneath a lot of that. But before we do, can you just give our viewers an overview of your background and how you came to be an artist?
Sure. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in Crown Heights area. My parents were both very politically active. My mother is African American from New Orleans, Louisiana, and my father is Jewish and German American from upstate New York. Um, and I always loved to draw, and my mom and my dad both encouraged it. And my dad used to love to take me to museums and art exhibitions and things like that. But I didn't study formally until college, and I went to Washington University in St. Louis to study printmaking and drawing. But I always loved drawing and painting.
So I'm curious because, to be honest with you, I always drew and painted and considered myself as an artist growing up, but I guess my practical brain took over and I said, well, I can't earn a living at that. It also sounds like you were really enriched in your parents taking to museums and kind of immersing you in the art world. So how did you choose it, not just as an identity, but as a career path? Because a lot of people would say, you don't want to be a starving artist. And so kind of talk to us a little bit about how that happened.
Well, actually, I wanted to be a veterinarian, but I went to
Really?
I went to Stuyvesant High School in Manhattan, and honestly was very discouraged from pursuing the math and sciences because I was a Black woman. I didn't understand that at the time as a young person, but that was the end result. And when it came time to think about what I wanted to study as for college, I thought, well, people think I draw well, so let me look into that. And I actually don't know how I got into art school because I really just had a sketchbook and some random assignments I had done, taking classes at the Brooklyn Museum of Art as a child or as a young person. But my mom was also very influential in my becoming a teacher because while she encouraged me to be an artist, she was very practical and that I had to earn a living. And so she encouraged me to also pursue education. And when I left college, I taught and got registered or certified to be a K-12 art teacher. And then when I went back to get my master's, I decided to pursue teaching at the college level.
So that's very interesting. I want to back up for a minute. When you said that you were discouraged, it sounds like maybe in some overt ways, in some maybe more subtle ways, to
Mhm.
as a um, as a woman and a Black woman, not to pursue math and science, and that
Mhm.
happens a lot with girls. I'm curious, what is there anything that you remember in particular? Because if you had that aspiration, I'm assuming you were probably fairly good at math and science as well, right?
I love biology. I was, I think math is one of these things where you're good at it up to a point, and then you need encouragement. And um, I think the environment at Stuyvesant High School was one where, students were, we tested in, so all of the students were good students, high intellect or whatever.
Mhm.
But if you didn't get it automatically, the teachers were not really interested in helping you. And if you were a person of color, even though we took the same exact test to get in, somehow we were seen as less legitimate being there. And I know a lot of my
Mhm.
classmates who ultimately went to schools like Harvard and Yale and Princeton were initially discouraged by their guidance counselors to even apply, that those were super reach schools. And I was told the same, that Washington University was a super reach for me and that I should reapply to only state schools. Um, and that there was a real systematic discouragement of the Black and Latino students to pursue the Ivy League schools.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, and it sounds like you didn't listen to some of that because you You did apply and you did
Mhm.
get in, and even you're sounding very humble, even though you said, well, I only had some sketchbooks. I was surprised I got in. I mean, clearly we can see some of your artwork in the background, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. You're clearly very talented. So, so obviously you must have had some, even if you didn't have the full blown portfolio, they must have seen you had some really good raw talent, because you certainly have honed your craft there. And kudos to your mom for doing both, as a good mom should do, right? For
Mhm.
both encouraging your art and your talent, but at the same time saying you got to be practical about it in some way. So you were able
Yeah.
to marry the art and the teaching. Um,
Mhm.
I wanted to. Cooney's done a really wonderful job of profiling you, and I watched the video they have on you, and I wanted to pull a quote from something that you said. I grew up having conversations with my parents about what my racial identity was and the way I see myself. So my question to you is, as a child, or maybe even as a teenager, what did that look like? And how has that, your sense of identity, shaped or evolved, or I want to say informed your life experience now as an adult?
Mhm. Well, I think growing up in a very Caribbean influenced part of Brooklyn, a lot of Dominican, Puerto Rican, Haitian families, I didn't have to think necessarily about my race at that point because people just assumed I was Latina. Although my last name was Buxenbaum, so that kind of threw them for a loop. But when I went to high school, that's when it became a real confrontation because people really demanded to know what my racial identity was in a way that was very aggressive and forceful.
Really?
Um,
Like, that's like, what happened?
Questions like, "Well, what are you?"
Oh,
I'm like,
wow.
"Well, I'm black." "Well, no, you're not."
Really?
Yeah, you don't act black, you don't talk black, you don't dress black because of the stereotype of what blackness is.
Right.
But I think at 11 years old, my parents divorced when I was young. My father remarried, and in my mind, when he was telling me about this woman, I pictured a black woman. But when I met her, she was a white woman, and kind of was like thrown for a loop. Like, why would my dad marry a white woman? I'm like, oh, my dad's white, because you don't think about your parents in terms of race. They're just your parents.
Yeah.
But then I started to notice how people looked at my father when he would walk around with my sister and myself. My sister is 4 years older than me. She developed very early, and so looked very womanly, even though she was still a child. And um, the way people looked at my father, as if the, we weren't meant to be together, right? Like this was a picture that didn't fit, because at the time it was much more rare to see interracial marriages. My
Mhm.
parents married before it was even legal for a black person to marry a white person. They
Do you
married
know what
before
they
the Virginia Love v. Loving decision.
Yeah. What did they I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. What
Mhm.
did they that's very courageous. What did they experience when they got married? You said before it was legal. So
Mhm.
did they what was that experience like? Did they have to hide that they were married,
Only
or
when, yeah, sorry.
no, go ahead.
Yeah, well, my mother had moved to Philadelphia and then to New York. She met my father in Philadelphia, where it was fine, and there were other interracial couples. However, when she took my father back to the South, to New Orleans, to meet her family, it was illegal. And so, in order to avoid being arrested, when they were out in public, my mother passed my father off as black, which in New Orleans is the only place you can do that.
How it tell me about that. How was she able to do that?
New Orleans is incredibly mixed.
Oh,
I have family members who have blonde hair and blue eyes, red hair and freckles. It's a very mixed culture in New Orleans because it was under French control for a very long time. They didn't have the same laws about marriage and interracial marriages, but there also was a system of um, the quadroon culture, where women were married by contract to plantation owners, and their children were born free. So there is a history of gens de couleur in New Orleans of free blacks who basically worked the system to make sure that their descendants were freed. But that also was about racial mixture. There was a lot of racial mixture there. So my dad, he was tall and dark haired, tans very well in the summer, as long as he didn't open his mouth or tell people his last name, he could have passed for a Black person. My mother has a story about my grandfather sitting on a train next to a man who was complaining about all these N-words. And my great-grandfather had blue eyes. And when he got up off the train, he shook the man's hand and told him, "You've been speaking to an N-word this whole time." So
Oh, wow. Wow. So when you said your mother passed your father off as Black, basically didn't say anything or just told people, just assumed that he was Black because he was with her, is
yeah.
and because he was dark hair and dark skin, like nobody really asked, it sounds
Mhm.
like.
Right. Well, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there, but that's the story.
Well, it sounds
Right.
yeah, so it sounds like a very courageous thing on your parents' part, and it also sounds like, you said as you were growing up, the conversations about race and identity were very open, and yet at the
Mhm.
same time, you said when you were around 11, you suddenly, in a way, realized, "Oh, my dad's white."
Mhm.
So, like, how did that kind of play out in your child's mind, like, kind of making sense of those conversations with the like you said, the reality of who your parents are? You don't think about your parents, they're just your parents, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's when those conversations around race really happened because I didn't think to have or to ask the questions until I was about 11 years old, and
Mhm,
becoming more aware, right,
mhm.
of the outside world and less insulated by my family. Um, and I think that those are conversations. Most of the conversations were around, um, you know, political issues, social issues, economic issues, and the inequality that we were seeing in the country. And my mother was always very politically active, as was my father in the labor movement. My mother was active in women's rights organizations. Women for Racial and Economic Equality was an organization she was a part of. And so these conversations were happening in our home all the time. They had meetings, and I'd sit myself down in the middle of these meetings and listen and put in
Mm.
my 2 cents. But it wasn't until I became older that I was more speaking from my own experience and having to confront um, people's stereotypical views of Blackness and having to challenge that, not just with my own existence, but with my words.
And through your art. So the theme of your art has this kind of double identity, in terms of I wanna ask you how you've talked about how you identify your race, how the world sees you, as a theme in your art. You say, a lot of your paintings portray these topsy-turvy dolls,
Mhm.
and you said just by the fact that in some of my paintings, I'm portraying a Black body, that in and of itself becomes political.
Yeah.
And you made a point to have the central figures in your paintings be icons of beauty when they might typically be side figures. And your message is not a specific way to look, but a shared history, a shared culture. And this theme of topsy-turvy dolls, and of course, your own history around intersectionality, growing up, having your father be, a white male, Jewish, and your mother being African American, you really have both of those that come together, and our world's kind of feeling topsy-turvy.
Mhm.
Can you say more about your artwork? I want to let's at this point, can we show one of your paintings? Let's show one.
Yes, please.
Can you speak to it a little bit?
Sure.
Okay, so we're gonna have thanks, Dave. Okay, this one's Black Lives. It's Black Lives or Black Lives Matter? What's the name of this one?
It's Black Lives, dot, 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 fill in the rest.
Okay.
Um, and the young woman in the back with the dark hair is my niece, Nina Buxenbaum Turner. She posed for me. And a young woman, Abby, who is a friend of the family. Um, and I started thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement and the political messaging that I had kind of avoided in my work for a really long time, because as an undergraduate and even as a graduate student in art, in painting, and in printmaking, I got challenged often about making paintings about black people, right? Black women specifically, or black men. And, I got questions like, well, why do you paint so many black people?
Really? What?
Yes, yes.
That's a strange question. Like what? Yeah,
Yeah.
it strikes me as such a strange question.
Well, the notion is that well, who's going to buy this artwork, right? Because a white
Mm.
art collector is not interested in images of blackness, and black people don't collect art, right? That was the premise of that question, right? How would I make a living making images about
Yeah.
black people if black folks don't buy art, right?
That particular, can we go back to that for a second? Because I want to, so that is such a powerful image. And it looks like, is that Manhattan in the background?
Yes, this is the view from Brooklyn, the Brooklyn boardwalk, into Manhattan.
And it's interesting because you see that they're very intertwined. Can you speak to the way that you have the gesture with the two women in that background? I mean, it looks like, and the expressions on their faces, like what were you
Mm.
trying to portray here?
Um, I think that often I think about ambiguous poses, because I think that the white female figure could either be looking for help or trying to get away from the situation, trying to separate herself from the black figure, um, or it could be a gesture of reaching out, looking for help. And I think that when I first started to really sit with how I was feeling about the Black Lives Matter movement, um, and what was happening, and the very public murder of Black bodies by the hands of police and civilians. Right, Trayvon Martin was killed by just a regular person.
Mhm.
Um, and in the Black figure, she's kind of resigned. Right, there's like this. This is the reality I live in. Right, this is something I've had to deal with, and it is painful and it is uncomfortable. And I think it's very hard for people to understand the anger in the Black community. And I was constantly having this conversation about, well, they shouldn't be rioting, they shouldn't be, burning down, their neighborhoods. And I thought, we
Yeah.
have a right to our anger, and nobody says that rioting is okay, but the anger is there because this has been going on for so long and people feel so desperate. So don't look at the rioting, look at the underlying causes of this rioting. And seeing young white folks being involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, I think is very important. And I think it's important for them to also be putting their bodies on the line, because when we look at the civil rights movement, the reason it really worked and was so successful was because there was a cross section of the American populace that participated in saying that this had to end. Right, this violence against Black people had to end. And so you had, members of all communities marching in the streets and protesting and being a part of the civil rights movement led by Black folks.
Very powerful. That painting is so powerful. Thank you for detailing that. And exactly in terms of you're speaking to just the anger and understanding the anger versus just pointing a finger and saying, why are they angry? Why are they destroying things? But
Mhm.
trying to get at what's really going on, what's behind that. The two women, I'm wondering in terms of your own identity and how you reconcile it, because you're descendant from both white and Black. So you literally embody some of this struggle. Can you speak to some of that? Like the white woman trying to get away, as you defined the Black woman sitting there kind of resigned, but she also looked incredibly powerful at the same
Mhm.
time.
Mhm. Well, you live the life. I mean, this is the what you know. And I think for me, being both, I had to experience racism in my own family. And as hard as that is to say, because I love my family, um, it's still, even when you have Black people in your family, it's still very hard to understand what we go through as African Americans in this country. And your family can love you and still not understand how they're still privileged as white people in a system that is designed to promote white supremacy and keep Black and brown people down. And that's a very hard pill to swallow. And I've had to have very challenging conversations with my dad, who I adore, because he, you know, I think has not been a part of political activism for a long time and has been seeing it from a distance for a long time. And I think that those are the kinds of questions that we all have to have. They're very uncomfortable and they're very challenging personally, and painful. And I think that this is the kind of community therapy we all need to be doing, because there is, when I talk about the topsy-turvy and the fact that we are connected, there is no separating the history of the murder of Indigenous people and the enslavement of African bodies from the foundation of this country. We are on land that was taken by force. From this land in particular in Connecticut was Lenape land. And we never talk about this history. And if we don't talk about it, if we don't work through it, if we don't have the painful conversations, then we are not going to move forward. And I feel like this time right now is a real tipping point where we are seeing we can either choose true democracy, where everyone has a say and where everyone is participating in the vision for the future of this planet, or we can choose totalitarianism and white supremacy. And we're seeing that being played out in our streets right now, right? Armed men protesting with no pushback from the police, burning Black Lives Matter signs in Georgia from AME churches, Black churches. This is a revisiting of our history of the burning of crosses. And we see no action by law enforcement that is supposed to be protecting Black folks. But if you have a Black Lives Matter protest, they're out there in force. There's no hiding right now the fact that this injustice is occurring, continuing to occur, and we have to say no, right? We need to move forward.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. I want to go to, you have another very powerful painting, Vestigial. And I have to be honest, I know that word, but I thought, oh my gosh, I want to look up that word and all the nuances of that word.
Yeah.
This is an incredibly powerful image. I want you to speak to it. But when I looked up Vestigial, and I'm an English major and I'm a word nerd, and I was like, I want to get on the nuances of that. And so I'm going to read the definition, and then I want to hear your personal experience with this painting. So obviously it's a body part or an organ that isn't developed or is no longer in use, you know, like the appendix or wisdom teeth, like they no longer have functions, lost functions that are as defined that our ancestors possess. And so an organ or part of the body, denigrate, rudimentary, atrophied, having become functionless in the course of evolution. And so I looked up the nuances of that word, and then I came back to your painting and I thought, wow, can you please speak to this?
Yeah, you know, vestigial, or a vestige, right, is a remnant, something that is a part of us, has been a part of our history, either biologically, right, or historically. And racism, enslavement is a vestige of our history. It's something that needs to wither and go away, but it has not. It's still here. It's still very present. I think of it like the vestigial tail, right? Like sometimes people are born and have that little extra piece that has to be removed. And we have not fully excised, obviously, white supremacy from our history. And I think that that's, for me, the struggle. And so when you see the image, it's kind of like looking and having to deal with this other figure that you never knew or expected that you were a part of, and having to find a way to work with that other figure, work with that person. Otherwise you can't move forward,
I
right?
mean, it almost looks like, yeah, sorry, Nina. It almost looks like the white woman is like trying to put the dress over her head and kind of hide, and the black woman is, you know, how dare you? Or that's kind of how I saw it. I don't know. Is that how did you mean it with these two figures?
Well, I think that's really interesting, your take on it. So I purposely choose positions that are ambiguous so that the
Mhm.
viewer can bring to it whatever they see.
Right.
Because people will read into the work, and it then becomes their own personal story. And I think that's what's really powerful about art, is that it presents an image, but the artist is not there to tell you what they mean. So you have to create the meaning,
I had
and
a feeling
people
you were
bring
gonna
their
say
own
that.
history into it.
I had a feeling you were gonna say that. You know, at the same time, they're very playful, you
Mhm,
know? Your images are very playful and like it's kinda like a hide and seek.
mhm,
And I see what you're saying is that a lot of your figures do have this ambiguity. So you're like, are they expressing this? Are they expressing that? It's like they're very inviting and intriguing. And every time I look at them, I can see something different. There's like all these nuances in there.
mhm. Yeah, and I think that that for me is the important part of it. I don't think I don't presume to represent all Black experience or all female experience.
Mhm.
I only can represent my own personal experience, but I find when I really deep dig personally into what is most resonant for me, that it resonates with others, because we all have real commonality in terms of what we want, right? Everyone wants to feel loved and understood and connected. Um,
Yeah. So it's your artwork is deeply personal, but it's also universal, and it also is speaking to, I didn't mean to interrupt you because we have really limited time, but I wanted to get this. It's also speaking to um the conversation, the broader conversation that's going on right now. And we have like 30 seconds, and I feel like there's so much more. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. I feel like there's so much more that we could cover here. So maybe might just have to have you back on again. Would you be
sure, I'd
game
love
for that?
to. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, and Nina's my neighbor, by the way, too. Can I say that? So
Full disclosure, I live down the road.
I know, I know. I should have said that at the beginning. But anyways, we're definitely going to have you on again. But if anybody was interested in any, because you shared so much, and there's so much here to unpack. If anybody was interested in contacting you directly, how would they contact you?
Well, I have a website, ninabuxenbaum.com. And I also have another website that deals with our activism on the environmental side, La Jolie Journée, which I can't spell, but for you. But you can just go to my website, ninabuxenbaum.com.
Okay, so they could access there, and we might have you on also for some of the food and environmental work that you're doing, because
Sure,
there's so many
absolutely.
places we could go with you. Okay, Nina, thank you so much for coming on,
Thank you.
and we'll be talking shortly.
Great. Thank
Okay,
you so much.
okay, take care.